Would anyone trade a prime steak for my husband? He's a world-class maid, but he wouldn't know a business deal if it hit him in the face. My wife's laughter was a serrated blade, mocking me in front of the entire neighborhood. She thought I was just a waiter in my own home, a servant to her extravagance. But as the cuffs tighten on her wrists and the flames of her envy turn to ash, she's about to realize that Garrick isn't just the man behind the grill anymore. I'm the one who owns the fire. The Houston heat doesn't just sit on you, it colonizes you. By mid-July, the air is a thick, humid blanket that smells of scorched grass and the heavy, sweet scent of mesquite smoke. I stood over the Weber grill, the crown jewel of our backyard, feeling the radiant heat from the white-hot coals seeping into my skin. Sweat pooled at the small of my back, tracing a slow, itchy path down my spine. To anyone watching, I was just the man behind the apron, the youngest son of the family, the one who was always good with his hands. I've spent 8 years as the peacekeeper of this household. 8 years of folding my ambitions into neat little squares and tucking them away so there would be more room for Jocelyn's. My hands told the story she never bothered to read. They were calloused, the knuckles scarred by minor burns from years of keeping the world turning while she slept. I looked down at them, broad, steady, and covered in a fine layer of ash. I didn't mind the work. I grew up believing that true strength isn't found in the loudest voice in the room, but in the hands that hold everything together when the wind starts to howl. Have you ever realized that the person doing the most for the family is often the one they forget to thank? It's a slow erosion of the soul. You start as a pillar, and you end up as a doormat, and the transition happens so quietly you don't even hear the hinges creak. Jocelyn's laughter cut through the hum of the patio fans like a serrated blade. She was on her third glass of Chardonnay, her cheeks flushed with a mix of alcohol and the intoxicating power of an audience. She stood near the center of the patio, gesturing dramatically toward the grill. Our neighbors, people I've mowed lawns for and helped with broken pipes, leaned in, their faces tight with that awkward, voyeuristic curiosity that precedes a train wreck. "Look at him," Jocelyn chirped, her voice carrying a sharp, performative edge. "Garrick is just reliable, like a well-oiled toaster. My older brothers are out there closing private equity deals in North Houston, and my husband? He's mastered the art of the medium-rare patty." I kept my eyes on the meat. I flipped a ribeye, the fat rendering and spitting back at me, a tiny sting of oil hitting my forearm. I didn't flinch. I had learned long ago that the coals were far more predictable than my wife's moods. But today, Jocelyn wasn't satisfied with a nudge. She wanted a spectacle. She walked over, her silk dress shimmering in the harsh afternoon light, and snatched a perfectly seared ribeye right off the prep board with a serving fork. She held it up like a trophy, the juices dripping onto the stone pavers. "Seriously, though," she shouted, her eyes scanning the crowd for the biggest laugh. "Would anyone trade a prime steak for my husband? He's a world-class waiter and a maid, but he wouldn't know a business deal if it hit him in the face. Any takers? I'm looking for an upgrade." The laughter that followed was thin, brittle, and drenched in discomfort. The silence that rushed in afterward was even worse. I felt the spatula go heavy in my hand, a leaden weight that seemed to anchor me to the spot. I looked at the neighbors. The men looked at their shoes. The women adjusted their jewelry. They were embarrassed for me. They saw what I had tried to ignore for nearly a decade. I wasn't her partner. I was her utility. In that moment, a profound, icy clarity settled over me. There is a stoic belief that we cannot control the tongues of others, but we own the territory of our own response. I could feel my heartbeat, slow and rhythmic, against the wall of my chest. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't even angry yet. I was simply done. I set the spatula down on the side tray. The metal clinked against the steel, a small, final sound. I didn't shout. I didn't throw the meat. I simply walked toward the patio table, carrying the final tray of grilled vegetables. The movement was deliberate, a cinematic slow-motion transition that seemed to pull the oxygen out of the air. Jocelyn was still grinning, her fork held high, waiting for me to play the part of the bumbling, good-natured husband who could take a joke. But that version of Garrick had just died under the Houston sun. I placed the tray down gently. I looked at Jocelyn, and for the first time in years, I really saw her. I saw the hollowness behind the expensive dental work and the frantic need for validation that she used as a weapon against the one person who had actually loved her unconditionally. I didn't feel hate. I felt a weary, bone-deep pity. "Respect is a currency, Jocelyn," I said. My voice was low, resonant, and so steady it made her smile waver. And looking around this yard, I realize you've finally run out of it. The neighbors stood like statues. I reached down and slowly twisted the gold band off my ring finger. It felt lighter than I expected. I placed it on the glass table, right next to her half-empty wine glass. The ring made a sharp ting that echoed in the sudden quiet. I used to think the worst thing in life was ending up alone, I continued, my voice calm enough to chill the air. It isn't. The worst thing in life is ending up with people who make you feel alone, and I am tired of being alone in this house. I looked at her one last time, noting the way the color drained from her face as the reality of the moment finally punctured her Chardonnay-soaked ego. I had been the peacekeeper for so long that she forgot I was also the one who held the keys. "Garrick, wait, it was a joke," she stammered, the fork finally dropping to her side. "I'm not laughing, Jocelyn," I replied. I turned my back on the grill, the party, and the life I had meticulously curated for a woman who didn't exist. As I walked toward the gate, my eyes met Alva's. She was standing by the fringe of the crowd, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable, but her eyes burning with an intensity I hadn't seen before. For the first time in a decade, I felt like someone was actually looking at me, not as a servant, not as a younger brother, but as a man. The smoke from the grill followed me out, a gray ghost of a life I was leaving behind. I didn't know what was waiting for me next, but I knew I wouldn't be the one serving the meat. The silence that followed my removal of the ring was heavy, almost physical. It sat on the patio like the humid Texas air, thick and suffocating. Jocelyn stood frozen, her hand still raised with that fork, her mouth slightly agape. She looked like a statue of a goddess whose temple had just collapsed. I didn't wait for her to find her voice. I didn't need to hear the excuses that I knew were already forming behind her teeth. "I'll take that trade, Jocelyn." The voice was Alva's. It was calm, precise, and cut through the evening air like a scalpel through silk. She stepped out from the shadow of the porch, her eyes fixed not on Jocelyn, but on me. The neighbors shifted, a collective intake of breath echoing against the stone pavers. Jocelyn's face cycled through confusion, then a defensive, high-pitched laugh that died quickly when she realized Alva wasn't smiling. "Alva, stop it, you're making it weird," Jocelyn stammered, trying to grab the thread of the joke she had just shredded. "I'm not making it weird. I've always preferred substance over sizzle," Alva replied. She walked toward the grill, her heels clicking with a rhythmic finality. "You just spent 10 minutes telling everyone Garrick is low maintenance and good at keeping a house. In my world, that's called an asset. If you're done with him, I'm not." I looked at Alva, really looked at her, and saw a reflection of the man I had forgotten I was. I reached out and untied the strings of my personalized grilling apron, the one Jocelyn had bought me as a sarcastic birthday gift. It was a symbol of my labor, my loyalty, and my role as the invisible pillar. I handed it to Alva. The fabric was warm from the coals. I looked Jocelyn square in the eye, my gaze steady. "You can't unring this bell, Jocelyn. The price of anything is the amount of life you exchange for it." And I realized then I had spent too much of mine on a woman who saw me as a commodity. The party didn't just end, it evaporated. People hurried to their cars, avoiding my eyes as if my sudden self-respect were a contagious disease. Jocelyn retreated into the house, her anger finally bubbling over into a wine-induced rage. I could hear glass breaking in the kitchen, the sound of her shattering the very plates I had spent years washing. I didn't go to her. I didn't try to fix it. Instead, I walked to my home office, a small room tucked at the back of the house that she rarely entered because it smelled like work. I sat in the dark for a moment, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the blinds. My heart was a slow, heavy drum in my chest. I opened my laptop. I didn't need to guess passwords. I had built the network she used every day. I accessed my retirement accounts and our joint bank statements. Under U.S. banking laws, every penny leaves a trail, and I began to follow the one Jocelyn had tried to bury. The numbers on the screen didn't lie, but they certainly hurt. Over the last 18 months, unauthorized withdrawals totaling 6 figures had been bled from my savings. I dug deeper, my fingers moving with a cold, analytical fury. I found a hidden folder in our cloud storage, a series of digital receipts and wire transfers. She hadn't been spending it on jewelry or clothes. Well, not all of it. She had been funneling my hard-earned money to cover Baldric's gambling debts. My older brother, the one she always praised for his ambition, was drowning, and she was using my life as his life jacket. She was buying her way into his inner circle, desperate for the status she thought I couldn't provide. I remembered my late father's voice then, rough and steady. Character is what you do when you think no one is watching. Jocelyn and Baldric were watching me, but they only saw dollar signs, not a brother or a husband. I watched the digital cursor blink. It looked like a heartbeat on a monitor. Every transaction was a tiny betrayal, a vessel of my time and energy poured into a void. I realized that my support hadn't been an act of love. It had been an act of enabling a toxic cycle. I sat there as the clock ticked toward midnight, realizing that the nice guy I had been was finally dead. I didn't wake her up. I didn't scream. That would have been an emotional rescue she didn't deserve. Instead, I began a secure cloud backup of every document, every wire transfer, and every text message. I was preparing a legal bomb, one that was coherent and irrefutable under Texas community property laws. I knew the law would see the dissipation of community assets for exactly what it was. Forgiveness is a gift to the soul, but boundaries are a gift to my future. I wasn't losing a wife. I was losing a parasite that had been feeding on my silence for a decade. I looked at a framed photo on my desk, a family portrait from 5 years ago. I was standing in the back, the smallest boy, the youngest son, slightly out of focus. I reached out and slowly turned the photo face down. The house was quiet now, save for the hum of the refrigerator. I spent the rest of the night packing a single bag. I didn't take much, just my clothes, my personal documents, and the old cast-iron skillet my grandfather gave me. I moved with the quiet precision of a man who finally knew exactly what he was worth. I was leaving the house, the smoke, and the lies behind. The Sunday morning sun in Houston rose like an unblinking eye, white and indifferent. I sat at the granite kitchen island, the cold stone pressing against my forearms. The house was unnervingly quiet, a stark contrast to the shattered glass and wine-soaked bitterness of the night before. I had spent the dawn hours finalizing the inventory of my life. On the counter sat 2 folders, color-coded and precise. The physical manifestation of a decade of silence finally finding its voice. I heard Jocelyn's footsteps before I saw her. They were heavy, uneven, carrying the weight of a hangover and the arrogance of someone who still thought she held the high ground. She entered the kitchen wearing a silk robe I had paid for. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at my packed suitcase by the door. She expected a plea. She expected me to beg for forgiveness for overreacting to her little barbecue performance. "You're still doing this, Garrick?" she asked, her voice raspy. She reached for the coffee pot, only to find it cold. "You're really going to throw away 8 years because I had a few drinks and made a joke? Don't be so sensitive. It's pathetic." I didn't look up immediately. I waited until the silence stretched thin enough to snap. "Sensitivity isn't the issue here, Jocelyn. Theft is." I slid the first folder toward her. It contained the ledger, the wire fraud, the gambling bailouts for Baldric, the systematic draining of my retirement accounts. "You didn't just mock me. You plundered the future I was building for us." She didn't even open it. She just scoffed. "We're married. Your money is my money. That's how this works. Not in Texas, and not when the funds are diverted to cover your brother's felonies," I replied, my voice as clinical as a surgeon's. I slid the second folder over. "This is a signed petition for divorce. And this house? It was a premarital asset gifted to me by my grandfather. My lawyer has already filed the notice. You have 24 hours to vacate." The screech that followed wasn't human. It was the sound of a predator realizing the cage door had been locked from the outside. She tried everything, rage, then tears, then a frantic attempt to use love as a bargaining chip. She grabbed my arm, her grip desperate. "Garrick, please, we're family. You can't just throw me out on the street. Think about what we've been through." I gently detached her hand. I looked at her with a profound, weary pity. "I'm not leaving because I hate you, Jocelyn. I'm leaving because I finally love myself enough to stop participating in my own destruction." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, separate check. "This is for a hotel and basic relocation. It's not a gift. It's a testament to the fact that your cruelty didn't manage to kill my decency." I didn't wait for her response. I grabbed my bag and walked out. I didn't look back at the manicured lawn or the high-end grill. I was driving toward the outskirts of Houston, toward the east side, where the skyscrapers give way to rusted warehouses and the smell of ozone and industrial grit. I had scouted an old neglected scrapyard months ago, a place the city had discarded. The contrast was staggering. My clean suburban truck looked like an intruder among the jagged, oxidized mountains of iron and copper. The air here felt real. It tasted of metal and hard work, not Chardonnay and lies. I moved my few belongings into a small corrugated metal office that hummed with the heat of the morning. I found the yard watchman, a man named Miller, a veteran with a face like a crumpled map. He was kneeling over a sputtering generator, his hands shaking. He looked at my clean clothes with suspicion. "Yard's closed, son. Generator shot. Can't power the gate." "I'm not here to buy, Miller. I'm the new owner," I said. I set my bag down and knelt beside him. I didn't care about the grease staining my shirt. I spent my first free hour in 10 years taking that generator apart, cleaning the fouled plugs, and resetting the timing. When it roared to life, the look on Miller's face was the first bit of genuine gratitude I'd seen in a decade. "You're a strange one," Miller grunted, wiping his brow. "Most bosses just yell." "I've been yelled at for 10 years, Miller. I'd rather be the one who fixes things," I replied. As I watched him walk away, I realized that my servant's heart wasn't a flaw Jocelyn could exploit. It was a technical skill that made me indispensable. The strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire, and the most valuable gold is often buried under the deepest pile of rust. I was exactly where I needed to be. As the sun began to dip, casting a long, golden hour glow over the twisted heaps of metal, a luxury SUV pulled into the dusty lot. It looked like a diamond in a coal bin. Alva stepped out, her tailored suit a sharp contrast to the grime of the yard. She didn't look disgusted. She looked impressed. "You're a hard man to find, Garrick," she said, stepping over a pile of rebar. "I'm exactly where I belong, Alva," I said, leaning against my office door. She reached into her bag and pulled out a leather-bound folder. "This is a formal investment contract, not a loan, a seed capital partnership. 40% of the equity stays with you, but you have full operational control." She paused, looking at the rusted horizon. "I'm not betting on the scrap metal, Garrick. I'm betting on the man who stayed calm when his world was laughing at him. That kind of stoicism is rarer than platinum." I opened my own notebook, the one Jocelyn called my chore list. I showed Alva the real contents: logistics, rare earth metal market trends, and a disruption plan for the local salvage industry. I had spent years watching Baldric and his cronies overcharge for inferior materials. I knew their weaknesses because I had been the one cleaning up their messes. "They think I'm the smallest person in the room because I was the last to be born," I told her as I signed the contract. "They forgot that the youngest son spends the most time watching. I saw every mistake they made. Now, I'm going to make sure they never make them again." The ink on the paper felt like a seal on a new destiny. Alva took the folder and nodded, a silent pact formed between two people who understood the value of what others threw away. With Alva's investment secured, I looked at the mounds of twisted metal and realized I wasn't looking at junk anymore. I was looking at the foundations of my future throne. The transition from a suburban deck to a metal yard didn't just change my surroundings, it changed the very air I breathed. 6 months had passed since I placed my wedding ring next to a half-empty glass of Chardonnay. 6 months of sweat, rust, and the quiet satisfaction of building something that belonged entirely to me. I had traded the soft, suffocating comforts of my old life for the jagged, honest edges of the scrap business. But as the Texas summer reached its peak, the humidity clinging to the Houston streets like a damp shroud, I realized that the past doesn't stay buried just because you've walked away from it. On a dimly lit side street, far from the neon glow of the revitalized east side, a luxury sedan sat idling. Inside, the air conditioning hummed, a sterile contrast to the oppressive night. Jocelyn sat in the passenger seat, her hands trembling as she fumbled with a silver lighter. Across from her, my older brother Baldric gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were ghostly white. Their downfall had been swifter than mine. Jocelyn was drowning in credit card lawsuits, the lifestyle she had stolen from me evaporating like mist. Baldric was worse off. Our father's estate executors had finally seen through his shell companies and cut him off entirely. "The little runt is actually doing it," Baldric spat, his voice thick with a toxic mix of disbelief and entitlement. "I drove by that yard. He's got trucks moving in and out like he's a damn oil tycoon. It's a dirty business, Jocelyn. It's beneath our family. Yet Garrick is the one with the black ink on his books while we're bleeding red." Jocelyn lit her cigarette, the flame dancing in her wide, desperate eyes. He's doing it with Alva's money. He's probably laughing at us every time he looks at his bank balance. It isn't fair, Baldric. He was supposed to be the one who failed. He's the baby. He's the one who was meant to stay in the kitchen. Their logic was as warped as a rusted beam. They had convinced themselves that my success was a personal insult to their status. Baldric leaned closer, his plan taking shape in the claustrophobic cabin. They concluded that if they could make me desperate enough, bankrupt and broken, I would have no choice but to sign over my power of attorney for my share of the family inheritance. They didn't want the scrapyard, they wanted the leverage it represented. The copper shipment, Jocelyn whispered, her eyes reflecting the orange glow of her cigarette. Miller mentioned a massive haul of rare earth metals and industrial aluminum arriving this week. If that inventory disappears, his business loans default. He'll lose Alva's backing. He'll be back at zero. The plan was a terminal act of greed. As she drew a long breath of smoke, the camera of my mind lingered on her shaking hands. The flame of that lighter wasn't just a spark, it was the literal fire they were about to ignite in my world. They weren't just plotting a theft, they were plotting an execution of my self-respect. The fire started near the wooden pallets on the north perimeter, fueled by an accelerant that smelled of industrial solvent and hatred. It spread with a terrifying, hungry speed. By the time I arrived, the Houston skyline was being torn apart by an angry, jagged orange glow. The heat was a physical wall, pushing back the firefighters who had arrived just minutes before. Anyone else would have screamed. Most men would have wept, seeing 2 years of backbreaking labor melting into a shapeless, glowing slag. But I stood back, the smoke stinging my eyes, and I didn't move a muscle. I pulled my phone from my pocket and activated a thermal imaging app, recording the perimeter while the flames were still high. I wasn't watching the fire, I was watching the escape routes. Knowing Texas arson laws and the specific private security protocols Alva and I had established, I looked for the blind spots in my fence. Near a rusted drainage pipe, I saw it, a discarded container of a specific industrial degreaser. My pulse didn't quicken, instead it slowed. I recognized that container. It was the same brand Baldric's construction company used to clean their heavy machinery. He hadn't just attacked me, he had left his signature at the crime scene. Suddenly, a high-pitched whimper cut through the roar of the blaze. It was Daisy, a stray terrier mix I had taken in during my first month at the yard. She was trapped near the sorting bin, the heat pinning her into a corner. I didn't think about the inventory. I didn't think about the loans. I plunged into a safe zone, the heat searing the air in my lungs, and scooped the shivering dog into my arms. I prioritized a single small life over the tons of smoldering copper. As I walked back through the haze, shielding her with my jacket, I realized that Jocelyn and Baldric could burn my metal, but they couldn't burn my humanity. The next morning, the yard was a graveyard of black ash and twisted, blackened iron. Alva arrived as the sun began to bake the ruins, her face a mask of horror. She expected to find me defeated, perhaps ready to sign whatever surrender her lawyers might suggest. Instead, I was sitting on a crate, feeding Daisy a piece of bacon. Beside me lay a plastic evidence bag, containing the degreaser container I had recovered before the police taped off the scene. "It's gone, Garrick," Alva whispered, her voice trembling. "The rare earth shipment. The aluminum." "Inventory is replaceable, Alva," I said, looking at the black soot coating my palms. I didn't sound like a victim. I sounded like a man who had already won. "I'm not angry at the fire. I'm just saddened that my own blood would rather see a world burn than see a brother succeed. It's a heavy burden, being that small inside." I looked at her, my eyes clear. "They think they destroyed my business, but they only destroyed my stock. You can burn a man's barn, but you can't burn the skill in his mind or the peace in his heart." My grandfather used to say that some people are so poor, all they have is money. Jocelyn and Baldric are bankrupt in every way that matters. Then, I leaned in and shared the tactical truth. I had a gut feeling about Baldric's increasing desperation 2 days ago. I moved the most valuable rare earth minerals to a secure warehouse in Pearland on Tuesday. What's burning in those piles is mostly low-grade iron and old refrigerators I was going to pay someone to haul away anyway. They didn't bankrupt me. They just did my cleaning for free. Alva's shock shifted into a slow, appreciative smile. I looked at the soot on my hands and realized the fire hadn't turned my dreams to ash. It had merely tempered my resolve into something harder, sharper, and more resilient than any metal in this yard. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was the architect of their inevitable reckoning. 2 years can feel like a lifetime when you are building a kingdom out of things other people have thrown away. The soot from Baldric's desperate fire had long since been washed into the Houston soil, serving only as a grim fertilizer for my resolve. My hands, once only known for flipping burgers and fixing faucets for an ungrateful wife, now directed a fleet of automated sorters and a team of specialists. We didn't just buy junk. We reclaimed rare minerals that the tech giants in Austin and California were starving for. I was no longer the invisible youngest son. I was Garrick, the man who turned rust into a primary resource. The high-end corporate boardroom in downtown Houston felt like a different planet compared to the grease and heat of my facility. Sunlight glinted off the glass skyscrapers, creating a sterile, silver world where every word carried the weight of $1 million. I sat at the mahogany table, my suit tailored, but my mind still grounded in the grit of the yard. Across from me sat Baldric. He looked older, his face etched with the frantic lines of a man whose bluff had finally been called. He was there representing his failing family firm, trying to leverage a name that no longer held credit. The federal contractor at the head of the table looked between us. He was vetting suppliers for a long-term rare earth mineral contract, the kind of deal that solidifies a legacy. Baldric spoke first, his voice dripping with an arrogance he hadn't earned. He relied on the old, good old boy network, name-dropping our father and bragging about his construction-turned-salvage firm. He spoke about heritage and experience, but his numbers were hollow. He looked at me with a smirk, expecting the waiter he once knew to stumble over the technicalities. "It's about volume and history, Garrick," Baldric sneered, leaning back. "Something you wouldn't understand with your little garage operation." I didn't argue. I didn't need to. I simply opened my tablet and presented a proprietary, high-tech recycling process that was cleaner, faster, and more efficient than anything Baldric's outdated machinery could produce. I spoke about chemical leaching, logistical optimization, and guaranteed purity levels. I wasn't presenting a family business. I was presenting a technological revolution. The shift in the room was palpable. The power didn't just lean toward me, it settled there. I secured the federal contract legally and ethically, leaving Baldric to stare at his empty hands in front of the industry elite. Looking back now, I should have felt a surge of petty triumph. But as I walked out of that skyscraper, I only felt a deep sense of relief. The best revenge is massive success, but the best success is one earned through a clean conscience and a dirty pair of work boots. I had outworked them, outthought them, and finally outlived their expectations. This was the moment where the youngest son label was officially burned away. A week later, the Houston humidity was thick enough to taste as I stood in my office at G Recycle. The hum of the plant was a comforting heartbeat. My security team notified me that a visitor was at the gate. It was Jocelyn. She didn't come in a luxury sedan this time. She was in a rental car that had seen better days. She walked into my office with her head bowed, carrying a small ribbon-wrapped box, a gift for my birthday, which had passed 2 months prior. "Garrick," she whispered, her voice trembling with a rehearsed fragility. I wanted to say I'm sorry. I was misled by Baldric. He told me things that weren't true. I miss the life we had. I miss the man you used to be." She looked at me with eyes that used to make me fold, but now they only made me sad. She played the victim perfectly, claiming she was a pawn in Baldric's game, a lonely woman who had made a mistake. While I offered her a seat, I noticed her hand lingering near my terminal. She was trying to be subtle, but the desperation was a scent she couldn't wash off. I watched her through the reflection in the window as she tried to insert a disguised USB device into my primary port. She wanted my passwords. She wanted to access the company's financial backend to save her own skin. I didn't mock her. I didn't grab her arm and scream. I simply walked over, gently took the gift box from her lap, and set it on the shelf. "There's a genuine meal waiting in the break room, Jocelyn. Some of the guys' wives brought in authentic Texas brisket. Go eat. Walk away with what's left of your dignity." She froze, the USB device halfway to the port. The mask slipped for a split second, a flash of pure, unadulterated rage, before she composed herself and hurried out without a word. I hadn't lost my capacity for kindness, but I had gained the wisdom to know when that kindness was being used as a doorway for a thief. Seeing her walk away was like watching a ghost finally fade. Alva entered the office a few minutes later, her brow furrowed with concern. She had seen Jocelyn leaving and feared I had fallen for the distressed wife trap once again. "Garrick, Tell me you didn't let her back into your head, she said, her voice sharp with protective instinct. I didn't let her near my head, Alva, and I certainly didn't let her near the servers. I turned my monitor around. I hadn't given her access to anything but a honeypot, a fake system I had designed for exactly this scenario. The screen displayed a digital tracker, recording her every keystroke and the IP address she was communicating with in real time. It was Baldric's home office. She just committed a federal cybercrime, Alva, I said, my voice steady. They're so desperate to take what I've built that they've handed me the very evidence I need to protect this company forever. It's no longer just a family dispute, it's a criminal conspiracy. I stood by the window and watched the Houston sunset. The sky was a bruised purple, the city lights beginning to twinkle like fallen stars. I realized then that I didn't survive the fire just to be burned by the embers. I learned long ago that when a shark offers a hand, it's only to get a better grip on your arm. I wasn't a victim of their greed anymore. I was the one documenting it. As I watched the digital tracker confirm their location, a strange sense of peace settled over me. I wasn't fueled by hatred, but by a cold, legal clarity. They weren't just trying to steal my money anymore. They were walking straight into the trap they had spent 2 years building for me. Every move they made was another nail in the coffin of their own arrogance. I was ready for the end. 1 week had passed since Jocelyn's desperate attempt to breach my servers. In that week, the air in Houston felt charged, like the moments before a massive Gulf storm breaks. I knew the counterattack was coming. My older brother, Baldric, and the woman I once called my wife were not the types to fade quietly into the sunset. They were scavengers, waiting for the right moment to pick at what they thought was my carcass. I spent those days in a state of stoic readiness, observing the digital breadcrumbs they were dropping into my honeypot system. I wasn't just waiting for them to make a mistake. I was waiting for them to finish weaving the rope they would eventually hang themselves with. The explosion came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my executive office, reviewing rare earth market projections with Alva, when the silence of the facility was shattered by the rhythmic, heavy thud of boots on concrete. IRS and federal agents, armed with search warrants and a cold sense of purpose, swarmed G-Recycle. They alleged a multi-million-dollar money laundering scheme, citing anonymous tips and forged ledgers that claimed I was selling scrap to sanctioned entities. I watched them through the glass, their movements aggressive and clinical, adhering strictly to the U.S. Fourth Amendment protocols as they began seizing hard drives and digital assets. Outside the main gate, I caught sight of a black sedan idling by the curb. Jocelyn and Baldric were inside, their faces pressed against the tinted glass like vultures at a cage. I could practically feel their anticipation, a toxic mixture of fear and triumph as they waited for me, Garrick, the runt of the family, to be led out in shackles. They had provided the forged evidence, believing their digital trail was invisible. I didn't resist. I didn't shout. I simply asked for my lawyer and looked directly into the lens of the hidden cameras I had installed months ago. I knew exactly where those anonymous tips had originated. "Garrick, this looks bad," Alva whispered, her face pale as an agent began tagging her laptop. "It looks exactly like it's supposed to, Alva," I replied, my voice a calm anchor in the chaos. I meticulously documented the chain of custody for every item they took, ensuring that the legal record would be as clear as the truth. Looking back now, I realized that the most dangerous part of a trap isn't the teeth. It's the false sense of security it gives the one who set it. The interrogation room at the federal building in Houston was a masterpiece of sterile hostility. The walls were a flat, depressing gray, and the air was thin, smelling of old coffee and industrial cleaner. The lead investigator sat across from me, his eyes skeptical as he spread out the forged contracts. To him, I was just another greedy businessman who had taken a shortcut. He presented documents that appeared to show my signature on illegal export agreements, ledger entries that Jocelyn and Baldric had painstakingly crafted to mirror my real business transactions. "Mr. Garrick, you're a successful man," the investigator said, leaning into the light. "Why didn't you report your wife and brother when you first suspected them? Why let it get this far?" I looked at him, and for a moment, I allowed the weight of my history to show in my eyes. "Because they were family," I said, my voice full of a heavy, weary kindness. I wanted to give them every possible chance to choose the right path. I wanted to believe that 8 years of marriage and a lifetime of brotherhood meant something more than a bank balance. I waited until the law had to choose for them, because I couldn't bring myself to be the one to pull the trigger. But then, the peacekeeper was replaced by the scrap king. I began to deconstruct the evidence with surgical precision. I pointed out the metadata flaws in the digital forgeries, encryption protocols that my company hadn't used in over a year, and timestamps that originated from a residential IP address in North Houston, Baldric's home. I showed him that the titan they thought they were toppling was far more sophisticated than they ever imagined. A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes, I said, a faint, resolute smile touching my lips. My shoes are on now, and I'm ready to walk. The atmosphere in the room shifted when my lawyer entered, carrying a secondary encrypted drive. This was the moment of the 4K mic drop. We played the surveillance footage from my office, the real-time, high-definition recording of Jocelyn's apology visit. The camera, hidden in plain sight, captured her with terrifying clarity as she pulled the USB device from her purse and attempted to inject the forged files into my honeypot server. It showed her frantic, shaking hands and the cold, calculated look in her eyes as she tried to frame the man who had once provided everything for her. The digital trail was irrefutable. The server had automatically logged the origin IP and Baldric's remote access login as he attempted to verify the data transfer from his own study. The investigator's tone shifted from accusation to professional respect in a heartbeat. The evidence was so overwhelming that the warrants were redirected immediately. Jocelyn and Baldric weren't watching me go to jail. They were about to be the ones facing felony conspiracy, fraud, and a renewed investigation into the arson at my yard. I stood up to leave, but I paused at the door. I felt a surge of sorrow that had nothing to do with my business. They didn't just try to steal my company, I told the investigator. They tried to steal the last shred of family I had left. They tried to turn my own blood into a weapon against me. The tragedy wasn't that they failed. I had made sure of that. The tragedy was that after everything, they still thought I was worth less than the scrap I reclaimed. As the federal agents rushed out to execute the new arrest warrants, I walked into the harsh Houston sunlight. The air was hot, but for the first time in years, it felt clean. I took a deep breath, feeling the quiet power of the truth settle into my bones. Have you ever felt that moment when the weight finally lifts and you realize you no longer have to carry someone else's shadow? It's a silence that speaks louder than any victory. I knew there was only one place left for this story to truly end, the place where it all began. The drive back to the old neighborhood felt like traversing a ghost map of a life I had long since outgrown. 2 years had passed since I walked away from the smoke of that first barbecue, yet as I turned the corner onto the familiar oak-lined street, the air still carried the same heavy, oppressive humidity of a Houston afternoon. I had returned not to reclaim a house, but to close a circle. I had arrived to witness the final collapse of an empire built on shadows and stolen dreams. I was no longer the invisible youngest son. I was Garrick, a man who had forged a throne out of the very rust they thought would bury him. In the backyard of the house I once meticulously maintained, the atmosphere was thick with a delusional, upbeat energy. Believing I was currently sitting in a federal cell, Jocelyn and Baldric were hosting what they called a victory party. The irony was everywhere. Baldric was standing over my old Weber grill, his face flushed and sweating as he struggled with the vents. He was burning the ribeyes, the acrid scent of charred fat, a pathetic imitation of the precision I once brought to this space. It was a visual testament to a simple truth. You can steal a man's tools, but you can never steal his mastery. I stood by the side gate, hidden by the overgrown jasmine, listening to their toxic dialogue. Jocelyn raised a glass of expensive champagne, likely bought with the last of her dwindling credit, and toasted to getting rid of the trash. She laughed about how easy it had been to frame me, while Baldric chuckled about the inheritance money they planned to seize from our father's estate now that I was out of the way. Looking back now, I see the ancient wisdom in their arrogance. Those whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make blind to their own reflection. They were dancing on a floor that had already been pulled out from under them. The reversal happened with the sudden, rhythmic strobe of blue and red lights cutting through the twilight. The celebratory music was drowned out by the authoritative click of car doors and the heavy tread of federal agents swarming the perimeter. I watched from the shadows as the expensive wine glasses were set down in terror. Jocelyn stood up, her voice a shrill, frantic bird in the wind, screaming that they had the wrong house, that they should be at the police station processing my arrest. She was met only with the cold, methodical reading of her Miranda rights. The anonymous tip had become a federal trap. I chose that moment to make my entrance. A black SUV pulled up to the curb, and I stepped out, the tailored wool of my suit a sharp, professional contrast to the chaos. I walked into the backyard, looking every bit the Titan Alva knew I could be. I wasn't carrying a subpoena or a weapon. I was carrying a small, gift-wrapped box. The silence that fell over the yard was absolute as I approached the table where Jocelyn sat, her wrists already bound in silver steel. I placed the box in front of her.
"I heard you were looking for a trade, Jocelyn," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, resonant power that stopped the very air. Inside the box was a prime Wagyu steak, perfectly marbled and cold. "I hope this steak is worth the 10 years you're about to spend in a cage. In wine there is truth, but in the law there is only consequence." Before the agents led them away, I pulled Baldric aside. He looked like a cornered animal, his arrogance replaced by a hollow, shaking fear. I didn't strike him. I didn't even raise my voice. Instead, I handed him a business card for a reputable defense attorney and a small check, just enough for a retainer. "I won't save you from your crimes, Baldric," I said, looking him in the eye. "But I won't let my father's children rot without a fair trial. I don't hate you. Hate is a burden I no longer choose to carry. In a strange way, I thank you both. The fire you lit only forced me to build something they could never burn." The humanity of the youngest son was the final blow they couldn't understand. They expected a monster, but they were met with a man who had found his peace. I watched as they were escorted to the waiting cruisers, their shadows finally receding from my life. I walked back to the SUV where Alva was waiting. She didn't say anything, she just reached out and took my hand. As we drove away, I looked out the window as the sun set behind the Houston skyline. The city of steel and scrap, once so jagged and cold, looked like it was made of solid gold in the fading light. A man's worth is not measured by what he provides for others who despise him, but by the peace he finds when he finally walks toward those who truly see him. In the end, I didn't just build a business, I built a boundary. I've realized that while you can reclaim iron and copper, you can never fix a character that's rotten at the core. If you're currently standing in the fire of someone else's disrespect, remember, you aren't burning up, you're being tempered into something stronger.